Thank you, Mark. There was a little hyperbole in there, but who am I to deprive Mark of the pleasure of passing out bouquets? Just one little disclaimer, because Paul announced just before the break that, thank you to my generosity, you are all getting a copy of Resilience. I'm far too Canadian to go around passing out copies of things I've written, so I have to confess, this was actually Paul's generosity. So don't thank me, thank Paul. It's a bit of a challenge to kick off a conference like this, or I'm not sure you'd call it a conference, really, a gathering, a conversation, particularly following Mark. And I've asked myself, what was in Paul's mind asking me to come and give this keynote this morning? Paul never does things by accident, so I knew there had to be a reason, and it finally did come to me that Paul, in his very crafty way, had decided that the best way to start a conversation about collaboration was to ask a well-known serial non-collaborator to show the underside. So I come before you like at an AA meeting and I say, my name is Tim, and I really like to call the shots. But I have to explain, because I come by this naturally. I have had a long career, as Mark has just mentioned. I started off when I graduated. I went to Africa with the organization Canadian University Service Overseas, CUSO. It's now only known by its acronym, but in those days it was still Canadian University Service Overseas. I went as a volunteer, and of course, working for an organization with the word service in its name, going as a volunteer, I had to think of myself as helping others, giving. That seemed to be what the whole concept of volunteering was all about. I came back and I co-founded a couple of organizations, classic social entrepreneur, the heroic individualist, doing things, creating things. I had to go out and raise money, of course. You all know what that's like. That's competition that makes the Olympics look like they need the drugs. That's a cutthroat business. So my whole background, in a sense, has been in this world of community organizations, charities, highly competitive, as you all know. Then I changed over to the other side and became a grant maker. Well, we know what grant makers do. They're looking for the best organizations, the standout leaders. They're looking for that perfect project that's going to make them look so much smarter than any other grant maker. So again, this wonderful world of hyper-competitivity. But I did learn a few things along the way. Even despite my best efforts, in half a century, you're bound to pick up something. And I guess one of the things I learned was that, and St. Francis was quoted this morning by Paul as he started, that it's not really about giving. In fact, it's in the giving that we receive. And when I thought I was working as a volunteer, giving to others in Africa, I discovered, like I think all of us who had that experience overseas, that it was more about what we were learning than what we were giving. Somebody was teaching us. So it was much more an exchange, and probably an unequal exchange with us on the receiving side. And I guess I learned also that this competitive approach only takes you so far. It's maybe great for the ego, but it doesn't necessarily produce much in the way of results, and it certainly doesn't help learning. And in fact, that the project approach, the idea that we're working on a series of discrete activities that could be funded separately, bears no relation to reality. That's not how we live our lives. That's a kind of oversimplification which may well serve the needs of funders so they can put some boundaries around what their grants are doing, but it bears absolutely no relation to reality. So I guess over the course of this time, although I started off with my feet firmly planted in this very competitive environment, I've learned some of the shortcomings. So that's my story. I guess the interesting question is, why is this topic of collaboration and of innovating together become so important, so widely discussed over the last several years? And that's really what I want to talk about today. Why? Why is it so important to collaborate? And I think it comes down to three arguments. There's the austerity argument, the need to be more efficient. There's the impact argument, we have to be more effective, we have to demonstrate results. And the third one is what Mark ended up on, the issue of complexity. So these are the three things that I want to discuss. Let me start off with austerity. I don't have to go into a long analysis of the situation we're facing. Everybody knows perfectly well we're in an extremely competitive environment, not just in terms of what's happening to funding for community organizations and for the kinds of activities that we're involved in. Governments, of course, at all levels are having to deal with deficits. Some of it is a self-imposed requirement, I think. If you cut taxes, of course, you're going to have less resources to use for other purposes. But regardless, there is less money, and that's been translated into quite significant cuts, which are rippling now throughout the sector. But there's a bigger picture. There's a shift, obviously, in economic power from the so-called rich West to emergent economies. There's an aging population. These are all things that we know about. I think, in a way, it can be summed up in just these statistics. Economic growth in Canada and in other OECD countries is going to be slower. There's no question about that. It averaged about 3% over the last 15, 20 years. People now are saying if we're lucky, we might have 2% growth going forward. And that's because of international competitivity. This is the emergence of new economies in a much more tightly interlinked global economy. There's another piece to that, which is the returns that any organization, or any grant maker for that matter, that depends on endowment revenues, the returns that they can expect. We've gone from average returns of around 9%, 9.5%, to what people are optimistically looking forward to at about half of that. So you can imagine what that plays out to, and we're not at that now, as you well know. If you have any money in a savings account, yeah, where is the return? But it means that organizations that in the past were able to give out X amount based on what their endowments could produce are now cut to half of that. So that's another piece that is, I think, a pretty reliable indicator going forward. At the same time, you have a change in our population. There's been, of course, an aging population. That's a trend which has been underway for some time. But there's also been a slowing of our growth rate. In fact, the growth of population in Canada is now largely due to immigration. That means, of course, the economy is also going to grow slower because there are fewer people producing and fewer people consuming. The number of people in the labor force is going to be less, of course, in an aging population, which means fewer people paying taxes. And yet the need for government services is going to be at least as high and probably higher. So these are the kind of backdrop. And I think the important thing to bear in mind is this is not a stage or a phase. This is not what we went through in the 1990s when many of us working in the not-for-profit or charitable sector also faced a period of considerable restraint and really quite draconian cuts in funding coming particularly from government. But that was a time when the Canadian population was growing, the economy was still strong globally, where in effect Canada had taken some measures that were difficult and challenging, but had done so on its own. It could still rely on an expanding economy in the United States and others of our trading partners. And so in a sense, we dealt with the huge challenge of our deficit, and then we were able to once more regain economic momentum. So this is a new situation, and it's one which we can't simply hunker down as we did in the 90s and say, well, we just have to get through this and then things will return to normal. This is normal now. So from Grantmaker's perspective, we're looking at a change from one way of working, isolated projects, project-based grants, as I mentioned a moment ago, organizations which are looked at separately, grants which often, as you probably know to your frustration, are even designated to a particular part of a project or a particular component in a program, so that the organization that's trying to implement the work has to go from place to place to try and complement the work which is being provided by one source of funding. Not only that, but the funder then wants to see what his or her part of the overall project, what that's producing in the way of outcomes, which, as we all know, is totally artificial. Where we think of increasing the scale or the impact of our work, it's seen largely in terms of, again, expanding individual projects, growing individual organizations, scaling up. And of course, this competition which exists to try and find the best organizations, the best proposals to fund. So that's all part of a way of working, which I think all of us from our own experience would say is counterproductive and doesn't produce results. I think what we're moving towards is a new paradigm in terms of how funders and the people that they're working with. I hate this dichotomy between grantors and grantees, or whatever language we use. It's all so clunky and mechanistic. Where you had this distinction in their roles, with funder essentially occupying the space of the control, the decision maker, the assessor of the value of the work being done, the insistence on the accountability to the funder. And of course, the funded, although grounded in experience and in a sense having the capacity to implement, nevertheless being dependent on the donor and being forced to, in a sense, acquiesce to the conditions that are established by the donor. Moving towards a recognition that this is truly a joint effort, where what's important is the degree of convergence around what it is we're trying to accomplish. Yes, there are different roles to be played, but neither one can be successful without working closely and collaborating with the other. So I think the model is much more like this. There's still areas of competence and focus on both sides, the people who are providing resources and the people who are actually able to both develop, design, and implement project ideas. But it only works if you have that significant overlap in the middle, where there's trust, there's the time that's required in order to build trust and to learn how to work together effectively, and a willingness to accept that any serious endeavor involves some degree of risk, and that risk has to be a shared risk, not a risk which is simply put on the backs of the people who are actually carrying out the work. So this is this, I think, covers some of the areas of change which we're looking at. Now, it's even with the rationale and the logic that you might have for the need for this, I think we have to be realistic about how difficult it is. It's not easy. And it's not appropriate for every situation. There are lots of things that can be done by organizations working on their own. I think it's critical that we actually look at what are the advantages, but what are also the disadvantages of taking the time to learn how to work effectively together. To go back to the austerity theme, obviously one of the advantages is efficiency and the ability to share costs. And there's lots of work going on now across Canada as organizations find ways to operate more efficiently. There are many examples. For example, there are many instances of organizations choosing to combine their administrations or to share office space. Maybe the Kanoff Center in Calgary is one of the first places which actually developed that notion that you could bring a number of community organizations together, and there was a whole infrastructure which then could be shared. But this idea has spread. It's true now in Vancouver with the Sustainability Hub. Edmonton has Space Finder. Toronto has the Center for Social Innovation. Glenn Newby is somebody who, under the term of our common roof, is actually going from place to place and helping local organizations organize themselves to create common spaces. So there are lots of ways in which organizations are exploring how they could increase efficiencies by working more closely together. There are other areas too, though. There's sharing programs. I think one of the earliest one was the example of World University Service and CECI in Quebec, both of which were running volunteer programs that were in some respects quite similar, both of them incurring the cost of recruiting and training and managing volunteers, and they simply put the two together to create a new joint organization called Uniterra, which performs that function for both organizations. What they learned in the process was how very difficult it is to do that, even with a program which was so similar in its purpose and the way it worked. It proved to be a daunting challenge that took several years and a great deal of funding to find a way for the two organizations to actually merge their activities. There are other things that can come also, I think, from collaboration. There's certainly the networking and mutual support. I think many of us have perhaps had experience with the new phenomenon that you're seeing in cities of hubs growing up. There's one in Ottawa, there's one in Halifax. There's one in several cities, also overseas. It's an idea which initially was launched in London, in the UK. And these hubs really are places where social entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs come together and provide mutual support at very low cost. Sharing knowledge. And we have, of course, the best example right here in the room with so many people who've been involved in vibrant communities and the learning community. So there are lots of advantages if one can find the opportunities. But there are some downsides. And I mean, I talked about the time required for two organizations simply to merge their programs that were very similar in purpose and operation. That took about 3 years because the cultures of the two organizations were different. The languages they spoke, in fact, were different, even though both aspired to be bilingual. So the time and the effort required is something which is typically undervalued, underestimated, and seldom is that cost covered by funders. So despite the exhortation that we should avoid duplication and look for opportunities to combine and so on, it's one of the hardest things to actually get people to pay for. And as I say, the time required is typically underestimated. The other cost, of course, is that this sort of combining of activities can squeeze out innovation. It can actually induce a kind of groupthink, which is not fertile ground for new ideas to emerge. So again, there are pluses and minuses. I don't want people to think that this is so simple and obvious that we should all be doing it almost as a reflex. So I've talked about the issue of efficiency, the need to be thoughtful about how we use resources. I've talked a little bit about where this can increase the impact. I want to talk a little bit now about the issue of complexity, which Mark spoke about earlier. This, I think, is a kind of my analysis of how we see a change taking place in Canada's charitable and voluntary sector. And it's really moving along that axis that Mark talked about, from simple to complex. The past, the origins of the work that we do, of course, is in the concept of charity. And charity essentially is a response to immediate needs. So you see a person who needs a home or a bed or food or clothing, and you respond. It's the goal essentially is where there's a need, you try to respond, you try to address the problem as best you can. It's voluntary. It relies on people giving some of their own resources to respond to the need. And the purpose is to relieve suffering. That's what charity is. So it's a very simple concept. And it's an important one. And it's one that we should not lose sight of. I think the tendency is to think that there's some kind of progression towards a more sophisticated understanding. And I think it's important to bear in mind, particularly as we go forward, and I'll explain a little bit in a moment, that the concept of charity is something which remains with us. It's enjoined by almost every religion. It's certainly inculcated by our parents in childhood. So we don't want to abandon this as we move into a world that we understand to be more complicated and more complex. The whole growth of philanthropy, it seems to me, is a reflection of our understanding that the situation is more complicated, and that if you want to go beyond, and I'll use the same example as Mark this morning, if you want to go beyond simply providing a bed to those who are homeless, you have to look at the other issues. You have to look at what are the causes. Are there addiction problems? Is there a mental illness problem? Why are people on the street? So the purpose is to go beyond simply alleviating symptoms and try to address some of the causes. And out of that came the notion of organized philanthropy, which is not just benevolence, it's structured with the aim of producing a real difference. Alleviating symptoms, yes, but also trying to find cures. You know, this was at the basis of John D. Rockefeller setting up the Rockefeller Foundation 75 years ago. The notion that somehow one could be scientific in the world of philanthropy as you could in other domains, so that disease would be conquered by foundations allocating huge resources to medical research, and so on. And this is what this line of thinking produced the Green Revolution and all sorts of other good things. But it reflected our thinking around complicated problems, and we've now moved, I think, into another world, recognizing, and again, I'm just, in a sense, repeating what Mark said earlier, that the world is not just complicated, it's complex. And the problems that most of us are dealing with are complex problems. So, yes, there are underlying issues around why people are homeless, but it's not just the problems the individual has now in terms of some form of disability, addiction, what have you, lack of poverty. It goes beyond that. If a child has suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome, you're going back before the individual was even born. The social disparities that people experience are also predictors of many of the problems that we have to deal with later on. So the goal moves beyond simply trying to resolve a particular problem and saying, in some cases we have to rethink how the system functions, because the system is generating some of these pathologies that the voluntary and community sector is being asked to address. And how do we do that? Increasingly, it's not just by using government grants or private donations, charity. It's being much more imaginative and creative in terms of developing new forms of funding, new financing arrangements, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The result of this is much more in the area of social innovation than simply treating individual problem cases. So this is the new world that we're dealing with. And that's the problem we have. So how do we work for systemic change? And I think this is where we come to the crux of what you'll be talking about for the next week. We have to find new ways of thinking, new ways of resourcing the work we're doing, and new ways of acting. And I'll talk about each of these for a second. The evolution of philanthropy, I've mentioned just briefly, but I would say we're moving into a new definition, which goes beyond philanthropy. I've called it good citizenship. And this takes us from that original purpose of charity, which is to alleviate the symptoms of underlying problems, to help deal with suffering wherever we find it, through to the philanthropic notion that we have to solve the problems which create suffering, to this much more systemic level of bringing about change, creating public value. And the reason why we do this is not solely compassion, which is the driving force for charity, not just being generous or altruistic, which is what has powered philanthropy, but because we recognize that we all have a responsibility to contribute to the solution of these problems, and that even the old notion that somehow this could be a responsibility given to people in the community sector is simply inadequate to deal with the complexity and scale of the challenges we're facing. So I'm looking at this as a kind of redefinition or expansion of our concept of citizenship. That this is what it is to be a member of a community. It's giving, it's participating, it's being engaged. That's what defines our membership in a community. What it does is it forces us, or it is presenting us perhaps more than forcing us, with the challenge of how we change our thinking about the work we do. What we've been asked in the past to do essentially is to demonstrate that in return for the resources we receive from the public or from government grants and contributions or foundation grants or corporate grants, we are producing the outputs that we said we would produce. If it's sheltering people, well, we can count the number of beds and the number of nights they've been occupied. But now people are saying, funders are saying, the public is saying, that's not enough. We want to see the results of what you're doing. Not just that you're feeding people or sheltering people, but that you are trying to change the situation so that you don't have to come back every year and ask me for a donation as you did last year and the year before and the year before, because I want to know whether my donations, or for that matter, corporate grants or others, are actually making a difference. So tell me what outcomes you're receiving. That's not something, by and large, we've been asked to do in the past. And most of us, frankly, would have a very hard time doing it. What we've been rewarded for is compliance. All this exhortation to be accountable really boils down to, are you doing what you said you would do? Are you doing what I paid you to do? The indicator in the future is going to be much less, are you doing what you said you would do, is, are you solving the problem? Show me that as a result of the resources that we gave you, either through taxes or through donations, there's a difference, there's a change. And, although it's not polite to mention it in some company, that underlying a lot of what we do is simply the struggle to survive as organizations. And we all know that's the truth, even though it's not something we usually put on our letterhead. The fact is, in the future, this is going to be much less important. We're going to see a lot of organizations go out of business, inexorably, because they won't be able to adapt to a new environment, or because they won't be able to meet the new requirements of demonstrating performance. So mission fulfillment, whether it's through an organization that exists or a structure that we've invested a lot of time and effort in creating, mission fulfillment is going to be much, much more important. So new ways of thinking about our work is going to be absolutely critical. We can think about our work, but we also have to find ways to generate the resources we need. And here I think there's a shift that is taking place. It's probably more needed in Canada than elsewhere because we operate within a particularly restrictive set of rules governing what we can do as charities. And we've all heard over the last 6 months, various claims about, people in the charitable sector, they're subversives, they're receiving money from overseas to block what's in Canada's best interest, et cetera, et cetera. It's all because what actually qualifies as a charitable act in Canada is much more restrictive than in the United States or Australia or New Zealand or the UK. So we've had a model which says, essentially what we're doing is a group of people coming together, or the famous institutional entrepreneur coming together and defining a problem and saying, I think I've got a way of dealing with that. I've got to go and find some money in order to enable me to get this going. I'll go to a foundation, I will go to my friends, I will find a way to raise money. That, of course, requires a charitable registration number, and once the charitable registration is in place, in a sense that defines what you can do. That's what I call the kind of the grant world that many of us have existed in, the funding model. What we're going to be moving towards, I think, is more of a financing model, where, again, somebody or some group defines what a problem is and comes up with what they think is a viable solution. But instead of leaping to the conclusion that they need to go and find a grant in order to make it possible to implement that solution, they ask themselves, what is the business model which will generate the resources we need in order to implement our work? And the business model may well be, we need to create a charitable organization. Or it may be, we need to create a social enterprise, a not-for-profit. More and more I'm finding that young people are saying, why are we going to create a charitable organization with all the limitations that imposes in terms of being able to access capital and being able to work as we would like to work, as is taken for granted in the private sector, if that's going to impede our capacity to do what we need to do? Why not just create a not-for-profit or even a business, a for-profit? The motive isn't to maximize profit. The motive is to get to reach an objective. But we can be very flexible in terms of deciding what the appropriate structure is in order to maximize our chances of reaching that objective. So this I see as a shift from a funding to a financing model. And this is the kind of language that increasingly one is hearing, and I'm sure this is all old news to most of you. Social finance, which really is simply mobilizing capital for a variety of public purposes, creating public goods. There are a lot of social enterprises. Co-ops have been in existence in Canada, goodness knows, for a very long time. But there are also new ways now of thinking among grantors. Program-related investments, for example. This is relatively new. It's relatively new because in Canada, the Canada Revenue Agency was not very clear that this actually was allowable for charitable organizations. It's only in the last year that they've made it clear that it is perfectly acceptable for organizations to use their endowments to invest in activities that are consistent with their objectives, even if there's a trade-off in terms of the financial return as opposed to the social return. So this is something which is starting up in Canada, but it's moving extremely quickly. Surprisingly, it's the community foundations that have been the first to take up the opportunity. Edmonton has really blazed the trail, but you have Vancouver, you have Ottawa, you have Hamilton, you have a number of other community foundations that are saying, we have to use a portion of our endowment at least to pursue our objectives, it makes no sense to try to accomplish our whole, the ways in which we can be supportive to groups in the community only by using the 3.5% that we legally have to disperse and having the other 96.5% of our assets in traditional investments. Private foundations that I thought would be quicker off the mark have actually been relatively conservative. Surprise, surprise. I think one of the things that has begun to tip the scale is simply the low rate of return in traditional investments. A lot of boards and investment committees said it's far too risky to take some of our assets and invest them in community activities. And then, of course, after 2008, they realized that maybe it's time to think about risk differently. And maybe some of these activities taking place in the community, various bond-like instruments to enable organizations to build, put up offices and so on, maybe these actually are quite a lot safer than putting money in the stock market or the bond market. So program-related and mission-related investments are something which are coming up. Shared value, of course, is even newer. This, in a sense, is looking at the corporate world and saying, it's not enough any longer to think only about how we put some of our returns, some of our profit into a foundation or into some sort of corporate social responsibility activity. We actually can build a business case around creating social or environmental benefits. So a company like Bullfrog Power in Ontario is a successful corporate profitable enterprise, and it is generating positive economic and environmental spin-offs by developing alternative power sources. So all of these are the new languages that we're going to be speaking, the two new terms that we're going to become more and more familiar with in the field of social enterprise. And as I say, this is simply a reflection that the old kind of dichotomy that we created between charity on the one hand, pure social return and no expectation of financial return whatsoever, and business on the other hand, pure financial return, no social benefits, whatever, that was far too simple. And in fact, there has always been other kinds of organization in the area between those two extremes, but they're becoming increasingly important. As I say, this is a relatively recent development in Canada. A couple of years ago, the Foundation and Social Innovation Generation decided that we would, in a sense, take a page out of the UK experience, where Tony Blair, when he became Prime Minister, recognized that the problems facing the United Kingdom were immense, much too large and complex for the government to try to address by itself. They had to reach out to the private sector and what they call the third sector, the community sector, and find ways to work more closely and collaboratively. But if they were to do that, the government would have to invest in building the capacity in the third sector. They didn't have to worry about business, obviously. Business has the skills and the access to capital and so on. But if they wanted to work with people in the community, they were going to have to help to develop that. And one of the ways was to find much more creative sources of financial support. And so a task force was created under Sir Ronald Cohen, which came up with a series of measures that would generate really quite substantial resources for community organizations. We saw that and said, well, why can't we do that in Canada? Why can't we, in a sense, liberate some of the entrepreneurial energy in the sector and give it access to the capital required to really have an impact? The federal government wasn't particularly interested in this, so we created our own task force, and it came out, as many of you probably know, with a report just under 2 years ago, which recommended a series of things, including telling foundations that it was time for them to put at least 10% of their endowment into what are now called impact investments, mission or program-related investments. So this report, I think, has had a significant effect. It has now been taken up by the federal government and by some of the provincial governments. And I think we're moving into a world where we're going to be able to be much more creative, much more enterprising in how we fund our activities. It's a big constituency in Canada. It's not just charities. It's the whole community economic development movement. It's in Quebec, l'économie sociale, which is well established and a source of employment for tens of thousands of people, social enterprises, social purpose businesses, and so on. And we're moving towards the development of a substantial marketplace. I mean, you only have to look at the relative size and scale of capital available to philanthropic or charitable organizations in comparison with what could be freed up if we were able to be more enterprising. There was a report done by the Mowat Institute about a year ago, which looked at the pattern of funding in Canada for community organizations. And its conclusion basically was government grants and contributions are not going to grow. Private individual donations in Canada have largely stagnated. Foundations and corporations increasingly are being, quote unquote, strategic in how they allocate resources, which means that the opportunity for responsive grants to simply support the work of community organizations as defined by them, those opportunities are less and less. The only area of growth, according to the Mowat report, was in income generated by organizations' own activities. So we're talking about potentially a significant marketplace growing to $30 billion. It's early days, but I think we need to be aware that this is the environment in which we're working. Which takes us to social innovation. The new ways of acting. One, I think, is through innovating, and we've talked about a lot of examples of innovation. There are lots of ways we can define it. This is the simplest possible way, and I'll be criticized by many for making it too simple. There are different kinds of social innovation, of course. There are innovations that are essentially sustaining of institutions and programs, and those that are disruptive. If we take an example of a sustaining, internally generated innovation, I think you could look at almost any of the major United Ways across the country. They're all asking themselves, how do we take the model which has worked so well for the last 50 years and adapt it to what our donors are expecting of us now? How do we manage that extremely difficult tension between the expectations of the community agencies that we fund, which need our support for their core operations, and the expectation of some of our donors that we're not just funding ongoing work, we're actually helping to solve problems. So they're by no means the only ones. There are lots of organizations across the country which could see themselves as generating new ideas to sustain their activities. If we take an example of an external innovation, but one which is still aimed at sustaining, I would say Pathways to Education might be a good example. With Pathways, the objective hasn't changed. It's still about keeping kids in school, encouraging them to finish their secondary school and go on to post-secondary education. So it's not a new objective, but the means to achieve it are significantly broader. It's not just about tutoring or after-class work or what have you. It's about marshalling a whole set of resources, the family, the community, the school, in order to encourage students and to reach the goal of ensuring that they complete their secondary schooling. If we look at the disruptive innovations, again, there are probably lots of examples we could come up, and it might be an exercise to think about, if you're going through a process of innovation, where on this chart do you find yourselves? I think perhaps an organization like the Natural Step, or perhaps the Stop in Toronto, for those of you who know it. The Stop is, in a sense, an evolution of the food bank concept, but going well beyond simply providing food for people. It now sees itself much more as a kind of community hub where food brings people in and constitutes, in a sense, the motivation for people to get together, but then the range of needs that people can express and look at collectively is far greater than simply adequate diet. Natural Step is also looking at how does it do its work around environmental conservation, but not simply through a kind of blueprint or a traditional structure. We have to rethink how the structure operates, maybe become much more of a consulting group or much more entrepreneurial in our approach, etc. And the disruptive change that comes about as a result of environmental pressures, again, you probably can think of examples. One of the ones that comes to my mind, but again, it's from Montreal, is a shelter, the old brewery mission, which traditionally had taken people in off the street and provided them with a bed for the night. And about 10 years ago, the new director, Jim Hughes, said, we're not supposed to be a factory for warehousing people. The purpose of a place like the old brewery mission is not to give people a bed, is to make sure that they can walk out of here on their own feet, prepared to deal with life, including finding permanent housing, etc. We need to reconfigure, we need to change our thinking about our role from being a place that provides a service, short-term, immediate, to a place that actually brings in all of the resources necessary to ensure that people can become independent and self-reliant again. So there are lots of different kinds of social innovation. One example of trying to address this, in fact, is represented by Social Innovation Generation, which is where I'm spending a lot of my time these days. This was an effort by the foundation, the McConnell Foundation, to compensate for the fact that as a funder, it had very limited resources. It needed to reach out and to create a much larger ecosystem of support for innovation, which would bring in academic resources from the University of Waterloo, as it turned out, on-the-ground experience of community change, and particularly how policy can be changed by bringing in the experience of Al Atmansky, who you'll be hearing about on Thursday, and his work with Plan in Vancouver. Tapping into the expertise in the private sector and government through MARS in Toronto, Medical and Related Sciences Discovery District. Bringing all these different pieces together. And the lesson for us was, it makes a lot of sense, and it's extremely difficult to do. Even with people who'd worked together for a long time, the cultures of the component pieces was significantly different. And finally, a different example that was mentioned briefly by Mark, Change Labs, which is a new way of trying to create a neutral space for people to take risk with a methodology about how to do that. So that's kind of an overview, I think, of where we are. And some of you may be left thinking, yeah, that's all very interesting, but I'm working in an organization in my community, providing a service that is needed. What does all of this have to do with me? Systems thinking, collaboration across different sectors, and so on. What's the relevance of the work I'm doing? The truth is, small organizations, I think this partly is why I said at the beginning, let's not abandon the notion that there are immediate needs that need to be attended to. So the work that's being done is important. What I think is new is the need to understand the context in which that work is being done. Where necessary, to take on a policy role, to look for allies and collaborators in the community, to see that even something as simple as attending to children, childhood diseases, if you're going to have an impact, requires reaching out to others. The example of Baltimore that Mark used, where in fact you've got to reach out to the police, the schools. There's a program in Montreal run by a pediatrician called Gilles Julien, Dr. Julien. He's developed something called social pediatrics, pédiatrie sociale, where the doctor is only one piece of the puzzle to ensure that children can grow up healthy. He has to work with the schools, he has to work with the police, he has to work with probation officers, he has to work with families to ensure that the environment in which that child is living is a healthy environment. Because what he's being presented with as a disease or an illness actually may be rooted in factors that have nothing to do with medicine as traditionally conceived. So that, I think, is a concrete example of how, even though focused on supporting children, there are other agencies that make natural allies and which actually contribute to the effectiveness of your mission. Just one other example. United Way in Montreal has invested a lot of money in developing what they call tables de concertation, which are really round tables. For the longest time, nothing could be seen of concrete results. And I'm sure that within Centraide, people must have been saying, how much longer are we going to fund people to get together and talk? The interesting thing, and it was in part, I think the catalyst in part was vibrant communities. In Saint-Michel, where you had one of these roundtables, a very poor neighborhood in Montreal with a very mixed immigrant population, that roundtable and the experience people had of working together over years, supposedly accomplishing little or nothing that was visible, actually became the foundation for a remarkable level of community vitality. When the time was right for people to work together, they knew each other well enough to be able to take that step. So, there you have my sad tale of ignorance and redemption. As somebody who started out, I can now stand before you and say, my name is Tim, and I don't always have to call the shots. It did take me a long time to discover that. It's obviously taking you a lot less time because you're already here. But I think the urgency, for the reasons I mentioned, the austerity that we're all facing, and which is, I think, the new normal, the need to demonstrate results, because that's what the public is increasingly asking for, and learning how to navigate our way through this extremely complex set of challenges that we're all facing, really puts much more emphasis on our need to collaborate and to innovate together. And I think you're lucky to be here, and you're here because you've earned, through your experience and through your willingness to find ways to work together more successfully, you're in for a very rich discussion. And I wish you well, because goodness knows the world badly, badly needs it. Thank you very much.